Picture this. It's 970 CE. A young dancer in China's imperial court performs for the emperor. Her steps so delicate, so impossibly graceful, that something shifts in the room. The way she moves on those tiny feet, it mesmerizes everyone watching. But here's what's haunting. Within decades, mothers across China will be breaking their 4-year-old daughter's bones to recreate what they see in this moment. This isn't just about dance. This is about how one woman's natural beauty became a 1,000-year nightmare that crippled generations of girls. Hey there, night owls. Get comfortable, dim the lights, settle into bed. We're diving into one of history's most disturbing practices tonight, but I promise we'll handle it with care. If you're new here, consider subscribing. These bedtime history stories come out every week. I'm curious. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Are you in Tokyo at 2 a.m.? London at midnight? I love knowing we're all scattered across the world, sharing these stories together in the dark. From dance to domination. The Song Dynasty, 970 CE. Emperor Li Yu's court buzzes with anticipation. Tonight, his favorite concubine Yao Niang will dance. She steps into the golden lotus-shaped platform, her feet impossibly small, naturally delicate. As she begins to move, every eye in the room follows her graceful steps, the tinkling of tiny bells on her ankles, the way she seems to float rather than walk. Li Yu watches, completely captivated. He doesn't realize it yet, but this performance will change Chinese culture forever. Yao Niang wasn't trying to start anything. She was just dancing. But her feet, they were naturally tiny, maybe 3 inches long. In that court, surrounded by wealth and power, her delicate steps became the standard of beauty. Courtiers whispered about those perfect little feet. They called them golden lotuses. The emperor couldn't look away. Here's what's wild. Yao Niang probably had no idea that her natural gift would soon become every Chinese mother's obligation to recreate through pain and bone breaking in their own daughters. Word spreads through the palace corridors. Other court ladies start studying Yao Niang's walk, trying to mimic that distinctive sway. Some bind cloth around their feet, attempting to make them appear smaller. It doesn't really work, but the obsession grows. Court fashion becomes about tiny shoes, delicate steps, that floating quality. The emperor's preference shapes everything. What he finds beautiful becomes what everyone desperately wants to achieve, and aristocratic families outside the palace walls, they're watching closely, taking notes on imperial tastes. This is where it gets darker. Wealthy families start thinking, if the emperor loves tiny feet, maybe binding their daughter's feet isn't just about beauty anymore. Maybe it's about survival, about marriage prospects, about social climbing. The first mothers to try this aren't monsters, they're strategic. They see how court dancers with small feet get noticed, get favored, get security, so they start experimenting with their daughters' feet. Gentle binding at first, nothing too extreme, just trying to recreate that imperial preference in their own homes. The transformation happens gradually. What begins as court fashion becomes social currency. Rich families in the capital start competing. Whose daughter has the most delicate feet, the most graceful walk, the tiniest embroidered shoes? It's like a twisted beauty pageant where 4-year-olds are the contestants. Mothers compare their daughter's feet size the way we might compare test scores today. 3.5 inches is good. 3 inches is exceptional. Anything larger, well, that daughter might struggle to marry well. The pressure builds. Here's where Emperor Li Yu's innocent preference becomes something monstrous. Mothers realize gentle binding isn't enough. To get truly tiny feet like Yao Niang's, they need to break bones, fold toes, force the arch to collapse. The first time a mother does this to her daughter, imagine that moment, the child screaming, the mother crying but continuing anyway, because she genuinely believes this pain now will prevent greater pain later. A daughter with big feet won't marry into a good family, won't have security, will shame the parents. The practice spreads like a social contagion. Neighborhood by neighborhood, family by family, mothers who resist are pressured by grandmothers, by neighbors, by their own husbands. Look at the Wang family's daughter. Such beautiful tiny feet. She'll marry a merchant's son. Your daughter with those big feet? Who will want her? The logic becomes circular and inescapable. You must bind your daughter's feet because everyone else is binding their daughter's feet. It's not cruelty anymore, it's just necessary preparation for adulthood. What's haunting is how quickly this becomes normal. Within 2 generations, mothers who went through foot binding themselves are binding their own daughters. They know the pain intimately, yet they still do it. They've internalized the belief that unbounded feet equal poverty and shame. The practice moves beyond the wealthy. Middle-class families bind their daughters' feet, hoping to marry them up into aristocracy. Even some poor families sacrifice their daughters' mobility, believing tiny feet might be their only path to a better life. The court dancers who started this trend, they become legends. Stories about Yaonyang's graceful dancing spread across China, but the stories transform in the telling. People forget she was born with naturally small feet. The legend becomes about her perfect bound feet, about how binding created her beauty. Young girls hear these stories and dream of having feet like the famous dancer, not understanding the difference between natural delicacy and forced deformity. The myth grows more powerful than the truth. By the late Song dynasty, foot binding has its own rituals, its own specialists, professional foot binders who travel between wealthy households, mothers who are particularly skilled at the binding technique, special shoes, special binding cloths, special herbs for the inevitable infections. What started as imperial court fashion has become an entire industry built around crippling little girls. The normalization is complete. No one questions it anymore. It's just what you do to prepare your daughter for marriage and adult life. The wealthy families who first copied imperial fashion pat themselves on the back. Their strategy worked. Their daughters with bound feet are marrying into good families, securing advantageous matches. The pain was worth it, they tell themselves. They've given their daughters the tools for social success. Other families see these successful marriages and think, we need to bind our daughters' feet too. The practice becomes self-perpetuating. Success stories fuel more binding, more broken bones, more normalized suffering, dressed up as parental love and wisdom. Emperor Li Yu probably never imagined this outcome. His personal preference for one dancer's naturally delicate feet has reshaped Chinese society. Millions of girls will have their bones broken in pursuit of his aesthetic ideal. But here's the thing about cultural practices. Once they take root, they develop their own logic, their own momentum. Foot binding no longer needs imperial endorsement. It's become necessary for any family with social aspirations. The line between admiration and obsession has been crossed permanently. The court halls where this all began still echo with the memory of tiny bells and graceful dancing, but now they also echo with the cries of countless daughters whose mothers love them enough to break their bones for marriage prospects. The Song dynasty has created something that will outlast the dynasty itself by centuries. What started as one emperor's romantic preference has become cultural law, enforced not by government but by mothers who believe they're protecting their daughters' futures. Chinese society has accepted foot binding. It's no longer experimental or controversial, it's expected, required, normal. The transition is complete. From imperial court fashion to social necessity in just a few decades, the stage is set for foot binding to become institutionalized across all of China, lasting over 1,000 years. What happens next? Well, that's tomorrow's story. For now, just think about how quickly something beautiful can become something terrible when survival gets mixed up with aesthetic preference. Sweet dreams. A painful path to perfection. The lunar calendar says it's time. An auspicious day in spring when bones are soft and spirits are favorable. The mother has been dreading this moment for weeks, watching her 4-year-old daughter play on steady feet. Knowing what's coming, she's gathered everything: silk bindings, herbal soaks, cotton padding. The grandmother nods approvingly. The neighbors whisper their encouragement. Everyone knows what happens today. Everyone pretends this is normal. This is necessary. This is love. The preparation begins at dawn. Tiny feet soaked in a mixture of herbs and animal blood, meant to soften skin and prevent infection. The liquid is warm, almost comforting. The 4-year-old sits quietly, sensing something's different but not understanding what. Her mother's hands shake as she massages the small feet, memorizing how they look whole and perfect. These will be the last moments her daughter's feet are unbroken. The mother knows this. The child doesn't yet. Look at this woman's face. Tears streaming down, but her jaw set with determination. She survived this herself 20 years ago. Her own mother held her down just like this. The cycle demands continuation. She whispers apologies her daughter can't understand yet, promises about marriage prospects and family honor, but her hands are steady now, because hesitation only makes it worse. Quick breaks heal cleaner than slow ones. This is what she tells herself. The first crack. 4 small toes bent backward until bones give way. The child's scream fills the house, echoes off courtyard walls, reaches neighbors who close their windows, not because they're cruel, but because they remember their own daughter's first day. The sound of breaking bones mixed with a child's confusion. Why is mother hurting me? The question hangs in the air between screams. No answer makes sense, not to a 4-year-old. Now the toes must fold completely under the sole. Imagine trying to walk on your knuckles, except these bones are breaking as they bend. The mother pushes harder, ignoring her daughter's pleas to stop. The grandmother coaches from the corner. Tighter. Smaller feet mean better marriage. Each toe snaps into its new position. 4 distinct breaks, 4 separate agonies. The child tries to pull away, but 3 adults hold her still. This is family cooperation. This is love. Next comes the arch. The curved bridge that makes human feet so elegant, so perfectly designed for walking and running. That has to go. Pressed down, compressed, forced to collapse inward. The arch bone cracks like green wood under pressure. The child's body goes rigid with shock. Pain this intense overwhelms the nervous system. She stops screaming, starts hyperventilating. Her feet will never support her weight the same way again. Never. The mother knows this. Time for binding. Long strips of silk wound around broken bones, pulled tight, tighter, impossibly tight. Each wrap cuts off more circulation, forces bones into unnatural positions. The child begs in broken sobs. Please, mama, it hurts. The mother's hands never pause. She learned this rhythm from her own mother, perfected it through years of practice. 10 feet of silk binding per foot, wrapped so tight the child's toes turn purple. This is just day 1. The screaming doesn't stop. Hours pass, then days, but the agony continues. Raw, constant pain from nerve endings that don't understand why bones are in wrong places. The child can't sleep, can't eat, can't focus on anything except the fire burning in her feet. Neighbors bring herbal teas meant to dull pain, but nothing helps much. This level of suffering, it changes a person, even a 4-year-old person, forever. Watch the mother's internal war. She holds her daughter through fever dreams, rocks her during pain episodes, whispers lullabies through tears. But every morning she tightens the bindings again, because loosening them means starting over, means more breaking, more agony. Better to maintain the torture consistently than repeat it. This is maternal logic in an impossible situation. Love expressing itself through methodical cruelty. Every few days the bindings come off for cleaning. The smell hits first, rotting flesh, infection, dried blood. Toenails growing inward, cutting into swollen tissue. Some toes turning black from lack of circulation. The mother washes everything with boiled herbs, applies powders, checks for serious infection. Then she wraps everything tighter than before, smaller and smaller. The goal is 3 inches. Currently they're at 6, halfway to perfection. Complications arise. One toe shows signs of gangrene, flesh dying from restricted blood flow. The grandmother actually smiles, dead toes fall off, making feet smaller, less bone to deal with. The mother stares in horror but says nothing. What seemed like disaster is actually progress. The child doesn't understand why adults seem pleased that part of her body is rotting. The logic of footbinding defies human compassion. The child develops coping strategies, crawling instead of walking, sleeping in positions that minimize foot pressure, creating elaborate fantasies where she can run again. She asks why this is happening, why mama won't make it stop. The explanations sound like gibberish. For your future husband, so you can marry well, so people will respect you. Marriage means nothing to a 4-year-old. Respect means nothing when you can't walk. Pain is the only reality. Other mothers visit, offering support and advice. They compare binding techniques, share stories of their own daughter's progress. There's a grotesque camaraderie here, women bonding over their shared cruelty. They examine each other's children's feet like farmers judging livestock. Oh, very nice arch compression. Such good toe positioning. They're not monsters. They're mothers doing what they believe keeps their daughters alive. that somehow makes it worse. Months ahead stretch like an eternity. The breaking phase lasts 2 years minimum, then years of maintenance, reshaping, perfecting. The child will learn to walk again, eventually. A swaying, unsteady gait on feet that can't properly support body weight. She'll wear special shoes her entire life, deal with chronic pain, infections, falls. Her feet will be considered beautiful, erotically charged, proof of her family's status and her own virtue. The mother rehearses justifications in her mind. This pain is temporary. Marriage is forever. Bound feet guarantee good prospects. Natural feet means spinsterhood, poverty, shame. She survived this process, found a husband, bore children. The system works, doesn't it? But watching her daughter's suffering, she wonders if maybe, no, doubt is dangerous. Doubt means her own pain was meaningless. Doubt means she's torturing her child for nothing. And so the cycle continues. This 4-year-old will grow up, marry, bear daughters, and when her first daughter turns 4, she'll gather silk bindings and herbal soaks. She'll choose an auspicious day, hold her child down, break tiny bones, because that's what mothers do. That's what love looks like in a society that equates women's value with their ability to suffer beautifully. Generation after generation, for 1,000 years, in the name of beauty. Picture the wedding night. After months of preparation, ceremonies and celebration, the moment everyone's been waiting for arrives. The bride sits on the edge of the bed. Her husband approaches, not to remove her veil or jewelry, but to unveil something else entirely. Her feet. Those tiny, perfectly bound feet that took years of agony to create. 3 inches of silk-wrapped bone that represent everything this society values in a woman. Tonight, they'll finally be revealed. This wasn't just tradition. This was theatre. The groom's family paid significant money for a bride with properly bound feet. They expected to see what they'd purchased. The bride's stockings come off slowly, ceremonially. Then the binding cloth, layer by layer. What's revealed isn't pretty by our standards, but in this culture, it's the definition of female perfection. Twisted toes, broken arches, skin marked by years of tight wrapping. To him, it's more beautiful than any natural foot could ever be. Chinese men developed an entire erotic language around bound feet. They had specific terms for different foot shapes, sizes, even smells. Yeah, you heard that right. The chronic infections and restricted airflow from tight bindings created a distinctive odor that many men found arousing. They called the smell fragrant and wrote poetry about it. What we'd consider signs of poor health, they considered aphrodisiacs. The smaller the foot, the more intense the aroma, the more desirable the woman. The obsession went deeper than just size. Men categorized bound feet like fine art. Golden lotus feet measured 3 inches, silver lotus 4 inches, iron lotus over 4 inches. Barely acceptable, they judged the curve of the arch, the fold of the toes, the delicacy of the heel. Marriage brokers carried detailed descriptions of potential brides' feet. Families hired specialists to examine feet before negotiations. A perfect golden lotus could secure marriage into a wealthy family. An imperfect binding meant social failure. Then there was the walk, the lotus gait. Women with bound feet couldn't walk normally. Their destroyed balance forced them to sway, to take tiny steps, to hold onto walls or servants for support. Men found this incredibly alluring. The helplessness, the delicate swaying, the obvious dependence, it all fed into ideals about feminine weakness and male protection. A woman who could stride confidently was masculine, unsexy. A woman who tottered gracefully was perfect. The more crippled, the more feminine. Natural feet disgusted them. They called unbound feet boat feet or duck feet. Large, ugly, masculine. Men would refuse marriage to otherwise suitable women if their feet were too big. Some would divorce wives whose bindings had been poorly done. This wasn't just preference, it was revulsion. Imagine finding healthy, functional body parts so repulsive that you'd choose chronic pain and disability over normal anatomy. That's how deeply this fetish had penetrated Chinese male sexuality. The wedding celebration itself became a showcase for the bride's feet. Female relatives would inspect them, offering opinions on the binding quality. Had the mother done good work? Were the proportions correct? Was the arch sufficiently high? These weren't private medical examinations. They were public evaluations of the family's commitment to beauty standards. Poor binding reflected badly on the entire maternal line. Perfect binding brought honor to generations of women who'd sacrificed for this moment. Men's sexual fantasies centered on bound feet. Erotic literature described elaborate rituals involving lotus feet during intimate moments. The feet were kissed, caressed, worshipped. Special shoes were designed specifically for the bedroom, more decorative and revealing than day wear. Some men collected their wives' tiny shoes as trophies. Others requested that deceased wives be buried with their binding cloths and silk slippers. The fetish didn't end with death. What's disturbing is how completely this became normalized. Mothers bound daughters' feet while genuinely believing they were creating beauty. Daughters thanked mothers for the excruciating process. Wives competed over foot size. Even women with bound feet judged other women harshly for inferior binding. The entire society, men, women, old, young, rich, poor, agreed that mutilated feet represented the pinnacle of feminine attractiveness. Pain wasn't just accepted, it was the point. The economics were stark. Unbound feet meant unmarriageability. No husband meant destitution. So mothers broke daughters' bones not from cruelty but from love. They were preparing them for the only life path available, marriage, and marriage required feet that sexually excited men. The system was circular. Men's desires shaped marriage markets. Marriage markets determined survival. Survival required satisfying male desires. Women's agency disappeared entirely. Their bodies existed solely to attract husbands. During wedding banquets, men would make crude jokes about the bride's feet. They'd speculate about size, binding quality, bedroom performance. These weren't whispered comments. They were loud, public declarations about a woman's most intimate body parts. The bride sat there smiling, while her future husband's friends discussed her feet like livestock. Her tiny, painful feet weren't just sexual objects. They were public property, available for male commentary and evaluation. The fetishization created its own vocabulary. Men wrote detailed guides rating different foot characteristics. They described the ideal texture of binding cloth, the perfect tension of wrappings, even the most arousing angles for foot presentation. Medical texts mixed practical binding advice with erotic descriptions. Poetry competitions centered on lotus feet themes. Art depicted women displaying bound feet in suggestive poses. An entire cultural apparatus existed solely to sexualize women's suffering. Even wealthy families who could afford not to bind their daughters' feet often did it anyway. Social pressure was immense. A family with unbound daughters was admitting they couldn't attract husbands through beauty alone. They were confessing their daughters weren't worth the investment of binding. Rich or poor, every family faced the same calculation: endure years of a daughter's screams or watch her become unmarriageable. Most chose the screams. The tragedy deepened when you realize many women genuinely took pride in their bound feet. After years of agony, they convinced themselves it had been worthwhile. They displayed their tiny shoes, boasted about their perfect measurements, pitied women with larger feet. This wasn't just survival strategy. Many truly believed their suffering had created something beautiful. They'd internalized their own objectification so completely that chronic pain felt like accomplishment. Society celebrated this transformation of pain into beauty, like some kind of alchemy. Girls who endured binding without excessive crying were praised for their strength. Mothers who produced daughters with especially tiny feet gained social status. The community rewarded everyone who participated in the system: the girl for suffering, the mother for inflicting suffering, the husband for desiring suffering. Pain became virtue. Disability became perfection. Crippling became love. By the wedding night, the grotesque cycle was complete. A 4-year-old's screams had been transformed into a bride's allure. Broken bones had become objects of desire. A mother's tears had produced a husband's arousal. The entire culture had convinced itself that female suffering was actually female beauty, that crippling was caring, that the highest expression of love was ensuring your daughter could never walk properly again. In the name of beauty, an entire civilization chose torture, to survive and to suffer. Here's what gets me about these historical accounts. We have actual women's voices, their memoirs, their pain written in their own words, and reading them, it's brutal. One woman from the 1870s wrote about crawling on hands and knees for 2 years because walking was impossible. 2 years. Think about that. Another describes sticking her feet under her mother's body at night so the pressure would numb the pain enough to sleep. These weren't just childhood memories that faded. This was lifelong chronic pain. Women in their 60s and 70s, still dealing with the consequences of what happened when they were 4 years old. One memoir describes waking up every morning to feet that felt like they were still being crushed. Every step a reminder. Every night trying to find a position where the throbbing would stop long enough to rest. The infections were constant. Imagine this, broken bones forced into unnatural positions, wrapped in cloth that rarely got changed, sweat, blood, pus soaking into those bindings day after day, toenails growing into flesh because there was nowhere else for them to go. Women describe the smell, this sickly sweet odor of rotting tissue that followed them everywhere. No amount of washing could eliminate it completely. Sometimes toes would just fall off. And here's the twisted part. This was actually considered good news. Fewer toes meant smaller feet. Mothers would celebrate when their daughter's toe became necrotic and detached. They'd rewrap the foot tighter, forcing it into an even smaller shape. The goal was always smaller, always more compressed, always more damaged. Because damaged meant desirable, damaged meant marriageable. One woman's account from the late Qing dynasty talks about the daily routine of unwrapping, cleaning, and rewrapping. She'd soak her feet in herbal solutions trying to prevent gangrene, pick off dead skin, drain pus from infected areas, then wrap everything back up in fresh bindings. This wasn't a medical procedure. This was just Tuesday, Wednesday, every day for the rest of her life. The walking. God, the walking. Women developed this swaying gait called the lotus walk because they literally couldn't put their full weight on their feet. They'd lean on walls, furniture, servants, each other. Long distances were impossible. Some women never left their family compounds. Their world shrank to whatever they could reach while gripping something for support. Independence became a foreign concept. Childbirth was its own nightmare for these women. Think about it. You're trying to give birth while balancing on what are essentially stumps. No ability to brace yourself properly. No way to walk during labor to ease the pain. Some women describe falling during pregnancy and being unable to catch themselves. The falls sometimes caused miscarriages. Their broken feet had broken their ability to protect their unborn children. And yet, and this is what's so complex about these accounts, many women expressed pride in their feet. They'd show off their tiny shoes. They'd compare foot sizes with other women. They'd teach their daughters the proper way to walk, to sit, to display their feet to potential husbands. The pain had become part of their identity. Suffering had become achievement. Disability had become desirability. The sleepless nights are mentioned in almost every memoir. Women describe lying awake for hours, feet throbbing, trying every position they could think of. Some would soak their feet in cold water. Others would heat them by the fire. Nothing really worked. The bones had healed wrong. The joints were permanently damaged. The nerve endings were hypersensitive. Sleep became a luxury most could only achieve through complete exhaustion. One particularly heartbreaking account describes a woman trying to run to save her child from a fire. She couldn't. Her feet wouldn't support running. She watched helplessly as neighbors rushed past her into the burning house. Her child survived, but that moment, that realization that her feet had made her unable to protect her own child, she says it haunted her more than all the years of physical pain. The social rewards, though, they were real. Women with the tiniest feet got the best marriage proposals. They were admired, envied, celebrated. Their wedding days were triumphs. Their tiny shoes were displayed like trophies. For many, those moments of social acceptance made the decades of pain feel worthwhile. They'd achieved what their mothers had tortured them to achieve. They'd survived. They'd succeeded. They'd suffered correctly. But here's what really gets to me. These women became the enforcers. They bound their own daughters' feet. They knew exactly what that pain felt like, and they inflicted it anyway, not out of cruelty, out of love, out of the desperate knowledge that in their world, unbinding meant unmarriageability, and unmarriageability meant destitution. They tortured their children to save them. The last generation of bound-footed women lived into the 21st century. Zhang Yunying died in 2020, at 107 years old. She spent over a century living with feet that had been broken when she was 5, a century of daily pain, daily management, daily reminders of what her culture had required her to endure. When reporters interviewed these elderly women, many still defended the practice. They'd show their 3-inch feet to journalists and talk about how beautiful they were, how their small feet had secured good marriages, good lives, how their daughters and granddaughters with their big natural feet could never understand the sacrifice, the achievement, the beauty of what they'd endured. Pain had become their badge of honor. Survival had become their source of pride. The medical consequences followed them to their graves. Arthritis in bones that had never healed properly, balance problems from decades of walking incorrectly, hip and back issues from altered posture, circulation problems from compressed blood vessels. Many elderly women couldn't walk at all in their final years. The childhood torture had stolen their mobility permanently. They'd paid in installments their entire lives, and yet society had rewarded their suffering, given them status, marriage, security. Their pain had purchased their place in the world. For over 1,000 years, Chinese culture told women that enduring this torture made them valuable, desirable, worthy. The cruelest part, many believed it. They survived by convincing themselves their agony had meaning, their suffering had been worth it, choosing cruelty over poverty. Picture this scene from 1872. A mother sits beside her 4-year-old daughter, holding silk bindings in trembling hands. She knows what comes next. She's lived it. The breaking of bones, the months of screaming, the years of chronic pain. Her own deformed feet throb in their tiny shoes, a constant reminder. But here's what gets me about this moment. She's not hesitating because she's cruel. She's hesitating because she loves this child so much it's breaking her heart to save her future. The mother's diary from that year still exists. Listen to this entry. Today I must begin binding Mei Lin's feet. I have delayed too long already. She is nearly 5, and mother says I am being foolish. But when I see her running in the courtyard laughing, I cannot bear to think of taking that from her. Yet I know what happens to girls with big feet. They become servants in other women's houses. Better pain now than humiliation forever. Think about the math these mothers had to do. A daughter with bound feet might marry a merchant's son, maybe even a scholar's family. She'd have servants, silk dresses, respect in the community. But a daughter with natural feet? Even from a good family, she'd struggle to find any husband at all. The marriage brokers wouldn't even show her picture to decent families. She'd end up working in someone else's kitchen, washing their clothes, raising their children while having none of her own. Here's where it gets twisted, though. The mothers performing this torture, they weren't monsters. They were survivors. Every woman binding her daughter's feet had survived the same process herself. They knew exactly how much it would hurt, because they felt that same pain shooting through their own feet every single day. Their bones had been broken decades ago and never healed right. Walking was agony, but walking was also survival, and now they had to choose their daughter's version of survival. The preparation ritual was almost ceremonial. Mothers would choose an auspicious day according to the lunar calendar. They'd gather herbs to soak the girl's feet, supposedly to ease the pain but really just to soften the skin before breaking the bones. Some mothers fasted beforehand, treating it like a religious sacrifice. Others drank wine to steady their hands. All of them knew that once they started, they couldn't stop. The process took years to complete, and backing out meant condemning their daughter to a worse fate. Imagine being 4 years old when your mother becomes your torturer. 1 minute she's combing your hair, singing lullabies, protecting you from everything that might hurt you. The next minute she's holding you down while she breaks the bones in your feet. Children don't understand economics or marriage markets. All they understand is that the person who's supposed to keep them safe is causing them unimaginable pain, and they have to trust that somehow this is love. The psychological damage went beyond the physical torture. Mothers had to become deaf to their daughters' screaming. They had to ignore the tears, the begging, the promises to be good if only the pain would stop. Some mothers cried while they tightened the bindings. Others developed a kind of cold efficiency, treating it like any other household task. But all of them had to kill part of their maternal instinct to protect their child's immediate safety in order to ensure their child's future survival. Here's what really haunts me about these accounts. The mothers weren't just inflicting pain, they were transmitting trauma. Every woman who bound her daughter's feet was passing on the same suffering she'd endured. It created this endless cycle where the victims became the perpetrators, not out of cruelty but out of desperate love. They genuinely believed that failing to bind their daughters' feet would be the truly cruel choice. That's how powerful the social programming was. The economic reality was brutal and simple. In a society where women couldn't own property, couldn't work most jobs, couldn't support themselves, marriage wasn't just about love or companionship. It was about basic survival. A woman without a husband was a woman without shelter, food, or protection. And as the centuries passed, bound feet became so normalized that refusing to bind your daughter's feet was essentially refusing to let her marry, which meant refusing to let her live a decent life. Some mothers tried to find alternatives. They'd bind their daughters' feet loosely, hoping to create the appearance of small feet without completely destroying them. But the marriage brokers knew all the tricks. They'd inspect brides' feet personally, measuring them, checking the arch, even smelling them because the chronic infection created a distinctive odor that men had been conditioned to find arousing. There was no fooling the system. Either you fully committed to crippling your daughter, or you accepted her social exile. The guilt ate these mothers alive. Listen to this letter from 1883. My daughter is 12 now. Her feet are properly small, and the matchmaker says she'll have excellent prospects. But she cannot run and play like other children. She walks slowly, carefully, always in pain. At night I hear her crying, and I want to go to her, but what comfort can I offer? I am the one who made her this way. I did it to save her, but I am still the one who broke her. And here's the truly devastating part. Many of these mothers started to rationalize the practice. They'd convince themselves that their daughters were better off, more refined, more beautiful than girls with natural feet. They'd take pride in how small the feet became, how gracefully their daughters learned to walk despite the pain. It was a psychological defense mechanism. They had to believe the torture was worth it, because admitting it wasn't would have destroyed them completely. The most heartbreaking accounts come from mothers who lived to see foot-binding end. Women who had dutifully bound their daughters' feet in the 1890s watched their granddaughters grow up with natural feet in the 1920s. They saw healthy, active girls running and dancing and working, and realized what they'd stolen from their own daughters. The practice they'd thought was necessary for survival became illegal almost overnight. Their sacrifice had been for nothing. But during the centuries when it was required, these mothers made their choice knowing full well what they were doing. They chose temporary cruelty to prevent lifelong poverty. They chose to be their daughters' torturers to save them from becoming society's outcasts. They broke their children's bones to keep their children's futures from being broken. It was rational, it was loving, and it was absolutely horrific. That's the complexity of survival in a system designed to give you no good choices. The mothers who couldn't go through with it faced terrible consequences. Their daughters might never marry, might become servants or concubines, might live their entire lives as social pariahs. Some mothers changed their minds partway through the binding process, leaving their daughters with partially bound feet that were deformed but not small enough to be considered beautiful. These girls ended up with the worst of both worlds, crippled but still unmarriageable. The mother's mercy became another kind of cruelty. So when we talk about the mothers who bound their daughters' feet, we're not talking about monsters. We're talking about women trapped in an impossible system, making the best choice they could from a set of horrible options. They chose cruelty over poverty, because poverty meant death, and cruelty meant survival. They transmitted their trauma, because refusing to transmit it meant condemning their children to something worse. That's the real horror of footbinding, not just the physical pain, but the way love became indistinguishable from torture. The desired deformity. The market buzzes with morning energy, vendors calling out their wares, children weaving between stalls, the smell of steamed buns mixing with incense. But one booth draws a different kind of attention. Silk shoes, tiny silk shoes, 3 inches long, maybe less, embroidered with golden threads, phoenixes dancing across red silk. The vendor holds one up, pride gleaming in his eyes. These aren't for children, these are for grown women. Women whose feet were broken and bound so severely they'd never fill anything larger. The perfect golden lotus, 3 inches. That was the goal, the absolute ideal that every mother dreamed her daughter might achieve. Not 4 inches, that was merely acceptable. Not 5, that brought shame. 3 inches meant perfection. It meant her daughter could marry well, marry up, maybe even marry into wealth. The vendor arranges his display with reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Because in a way, that's exactly what these shoes were. Sacred objects in the cult of the Golden Lotus. Proof that suffering had been transformed into something beautiful. But achieving 3 inches, God, the process never really ended. Every morning these women faced the same ritual. Unwrap yesterday's bindings, inspect the damage, wash away the blood, the pus, the dead skin that had accumulated overnight. The smell, accounts describe it as sweet and rotten at the same time. Infection was constant. Toenails grew inward, creating wounds that wouldn't heal. Sometimes entire toes would go black and fall off. The women called this a blessing. Fewer toes meant smaller feet. The washing process alone could take an hour. Warm water, herbal solutions, careful cleaning of wounds that had been festering for decades. Then came fresh bindings. Silk if you were wealthy, cotton if you weren't. But either way, pulled tight, tighter than yesterday if possible, because the foot was never truly finished. There was always another fraction of an inch to lose, always more compression to achieve. Pain was progress. Agony was aspiration. Every woman understood this mathematics of suffering. In the market, you could spot the Golden Lotus women by their walk, that distinctive swaying motion, weight carefully balanced because their destroyed feet couldn't support them normally. They moved like ships in a gentle storm, graceful but precarious. Young men watched with fascination. This was beauty. This was desire. The sight of a woman struggling to walk on 3-inch stumps sent their hearts racing. The more difficult her movement, the more perfectly she embodied feminine virtue. Helplessness had become the highest form of attraction. The wind carries whispers through the market stalls, women comparing foot sizes in hushed tones, mothers examining potential daughters-in-law with measuring eyes. Her feet are nearly perfect, one grandmother murmurs, watching a young bride wobble past. 3¼ inches at most. Her mother did excellent work. The bride's face shows no expression, but her knuckles are white where she grips her husband's arm. Every step sends shockwaves through bones that healed wrong decades ago. Beauty requires constant vigilance against collapse. Meet Mrs. Chen, 78 years old, bound feet since age 5. She sits in the market's tea corner, watching the world move past at speeds she'll never match again. Her feet, if you could call them feet, rest in embroidered slippers. She can't remove without help. The bones fused wrong 40 years ago. What started as beauty became a prison. Walking to the market today required her grandson's arm and 3 rest stops. But she's proud. Her feet measure exactly 3 inches. Perfection achieved. Mrs. Chen's morning routine hasn't changed in 7 decades. Wake before dawn, unwrap, inspect, clean, rebind. The process takes 2 hours now. Arthritis makes her fingers clumsy, and the old wounds never fully close. Her granddaughter watches sometimes, horrified and fascinated. "Why did grandmother do this to you?" she asks. Mrs. Chen's answer is always the same. "So I could have a good life. So I could marry your grandfather. So you could exist." Suffering justified by outcomes that only made sense within the system that demanded suffering. The infections never truly heal. Mrs. Chen's feet weep constantly, a clear discharge that stains her bindings yellow by evening. The smell follows her everywhere, that distinctive combination of decay and binding cloth that men once found intoxicating. Now it just marks her as old, as broken, as someone whose sacrifice outlived its purpose. Her husband died 5 years ago. The feet that won his heart now trap her in a body that can barely support itself. But she still maintains them with religious precision. In the market's dim corners, other Golden Lotus women gather, a sisterhood of the crippled, comparing notes on pain management and binding techniques. Mrs. Zhang shows off new silk threads her son brought from the city. Mrs. Liu demonstrates a wrapping method that reduces morning stiffness. They speak in code about their bodies, using flower metaphors for rot, poetry for agony. These women understand each other in ways their unbound daughters never could. They paid the same price, worshipped at the same altar of deformity. Watch Mrs. Chen attempt to walk home. Each step requires calculation, where to place weight on feet that have no arch, no functional toes, no stability. The cobblestones that others navigate without thought become an obstacle course of potential disaster. A stumble could mean broken bones that will never heal properly. Her cane isn't decoration, it's survival equipment. Yet young men still glance appreciatively at her lotus walk, that swaying movement that signals virtue and beauty, even wrapped in an elderly body. The cruelest irony, Mrs. Chen's feet achieved everything they were supposed to. Her mother's torture worked perfectly. She married well, lived comfortably, raised successful children. The system delivered on its promises. Her deformity purchased security, status, love. For 60 years, her broken bones were a source of pride. Only now, trapped in a failing body that can't carry her to her own front door without help, does she question whether the trade was worth it. But questioning feels like betraying her mother's sacrifice. Evening settles over the market. Mrs. Chen finally reaches home, exhausted from a journey that would have taken her unbound daughter 10 minutes. She collapses into her chair, feet throbbing with familiar fire. Her granddaughter helps remove the shoes, unwrap the bindings, reveal the twisted mass of bone and scar tissue underneath. "Beautiful," the girl says sarcastically. Mrs. Chen slaps her hand. "Respectful," she corrects. "These feet earned everything you have." But even she doesn't sound entirely convinced anymore. The daily maintenance continues into old age, because stopping means losing what little function remains. Mrs. Chen spends her evenings rewrapping, adjusting, managing infections that have burned through her feet for 7 decades. Her granddaughter asks why she doesn't just stop. "Just let them heal naturally." Mrs. Chen laughs bitterly. "Heal? Child, there's nothing left to heal. This is healed. This is what perfect looks like." She holds up a 3-inch shoe like evidence in a trial no one remembers attending. The other Golden Lotus women are dying off now. Mrs. Chen attends funerals where she can barely walk to pay respects, where caskets hold women whose feet were destroyed by the same hands that once caressed them lovingly. Their shared experience dies with them. Younger generations look at their bound feet with pity and revulsion, unable to understand that this deformity once represented the height of feminine achievement. The beautiful silk shoes gather dust. The perfect 3-inch feet become medical curiosities rather than romantic ideals. Mrs. Chen sits alone as darkness falls, massaging feet that will never stop hurting. The desired deformity achieved its purpose and became its own punishment. Beauty transformed into disability, aspiration into imprisonment, love into a lifetime of managed pain. She got everything she was promised: a good marriage, respectful children, social status, but the price keeps collecting interest daily. In every agonizing step, every infected wound, every reminder that perfection and destruction were once the same word, the Golden Lotus bloomed and trapped her roots in poisoned soil forever. Lustful longings. Here's where this story gets deeply uncomfortable. We've talked about the pain, the broken bones, the lifetime of disability, but there's another layer to footbinding that's harder to discuss: the sexual obsession that drove it. Chinese men didn't just prefer bound feet, they fetishized them, eroticized them, wrote detailed guides rating women's deformed feet like fine wine. And here's what's really disturbing. This wasn't some fringe kink. This became the mainstream standard of male desire across an entire civilization. The Qing dynasty produced actual guidebooks. Think of them as perverted instruction manuals, rating bound feet by size, shape, arch curvature, even smell. Yes, the distinctive odor from chronic infection and binding cloth became part of the sexual appeal. These weren't underground publications. Wealthy men shared them openly. They categorized bound feet into types: Golden Lotus, Silver Lotus, Iron Lotus. 3 inches was perfection, 4 inches was acceptable, 5 inches, practically unmarriageable. Women's bodies reduced to measurements and rankings. Picture this scene. A wedding night in 18th century China. The bride, maybe 16 years old, sits on the marriage bed. Her feet have been hidden in embroidered shoes her entire adult life. Her husband approaches, and the first thing he wants to see isn't her face or her body, it's her feet. The unveiling of bound feet was an intimate, erotic ritual. Men would examine them, touch them, rate them. A woman's sexual worth literally rested on her mutilated extremities. Sexual manuals from this period describe elaborate rituals involving bound feet during intercourse. I won't go into graphic detail, but understand this: the fetish was comprehensive. Men wrote poetry about tiny feet. They collected women's discarded binding cloths as erotic souvenirs. Bound feet weren't just preferred, they were sexually required. A man admitting attraction to natural feet would face mockery, even social ostracism. The fetish had become so normalized it defined masculine desire entirely. Let's be clear about what we're discussing here. This wasn't about appreciating small feet. This was sexual arousal specifically triggered by deformity, by pain, by helplessness. The distinctive swaying walk caused by broken bones, men found that arousing. The fact that women couldn't run away or stand for long periods, that became part of the appeal. The fetish was explicitly about control, vulnerability, and physical limitation. It's disturbing how sexual desire became intertwined with disability and suffering. Here's where it gets even more twisted. The most desirable bound feet weren't just small, they were the most damaged. Feet where toes had rotted off completely were prized. Feet so deformed the woman could barely walk were considered peak feminine beauty. The sexual ideal literally required maximum suffering, and women knew this. They understood their marriage prospects improved with greater deformity. Imagine internalizing that message, that your sexual worth increased with your physical destruction. The smell thing is particularly disturbing. Bound feet, wrapped constantly in cloth, never properly aired out. Dealing with chronic infection, they developed a distinctive odor, and men fetishized that too. They associated the smell with femininity, with sexuality, with desire. Women's rotting feet became an aphrodisiac. Think about that psychological conditioning, how completely a culture can sexualize suffering. Even the byproducts of infection and decay became erotic markers for an entire civilization. Wealthy men had elaborate preferences. They'd commission special shoes for their wives' bound feet, tiny slippers that emphasized the deformity. Some men collected these shoes obsessively. Others preferred their wives barefoot so they could examine the bound feet directly. The bedroom became a space where women's disability was displayed for male arousal, and women participated in this theater. Understanding their survival depended on successfully performing as sexual objects defined by their mutilation. What's particularly chilling is how this fetish shaped Chinese concepts of femininity entirely. Natural feet weren't just unattractive, they were considered masculine, disgusting. A woman with unbound feet was essentially seen as gender deviant, unfeminine, sexually repulsive. The fetish had become so dominant that it defined what counted as female. This wasn't preference anymore, it was sexual orthodoxy. Men genuinely couldn't imagine being attracted to women with natural healthy feet. The psychological impact on women was devastating. They learned early that their sexual value required physical suffering. They understood that men's desire for them was actually desire for their disability, their limitation, their pain. How do you maintain self-worth when your culture teaches that male attraction depends on your body being broken? Many women developed complex relationships with their bound feet, simultaneously ashamed of the deformity, and proud that it made them desirable. Courtesans and concubines faced particular pressure. Their economic survival depended entirely on male sexual desire. They had to master the art of displaying their bound feet seductively, while hiding the chronic pain, the infections, the daily reality of living with intentionally broken bones. They developed elaborate techniques for making bound feet appear even smaller, more damaged, more appealing to male fantasies. Their disability became their performance, their livelihood, their prison. The fetish created its own economy. Specialists crafted increasingly elaborate binding techniques to achieve maximum deformity. Shoemakers competed to create the tiniest slippers. Perfume makers developed scents specifically for bound feet. Marriage brokers used foot measurements as primary selling points. An entire commercial infrastructure built around sexualizing women's suffering. And women participated in this economy because they had to. Their survival depended on successfully monetizing their own mutilation. Perhaps most disturbing is how normalized this became. Chinese literature from this period is full of casual references to bound feet as erotic objects. Poetry romanticizes them. Love songs celebrate them. Art bekicks them. An entire culture's romantic imagination centered on disability and pain. And children grew up seeing this as normal. Boys learning to fetishize broken feet. Girls learning their bodies needed breaking to deserve love. The cycle perpetuated itself through cultural conditioning. Even within marriages, the fetish dominated intimate relationships. Husbands would examine their wives' feet regularly, sometimes expressing disappointment if they weren't small enough or weren't maintaining the bindings properly. Wives understood their husband's sexual interest in them was conditional on their continued disability. Removing the bindings, allowing feet to return toward normal size, could end a marriage. The fetish trapped women in permanent physical limitation to maintain their relationships. The psychological conditioning was so complete that many Chinese men genuinely couldn't feel attraction to healthy feet. When Western influence began challenging footbinding, many men resisted not from tradition but from sexual revulsion. They'd been conditioned to associate natural feet with masculinity, with ugliness, with sexual impossibility. Breaking the fetish required reconditioning an entire culture's erotic imagination. Some men never managed it. They remained sexually fixated on disability and deformity their entire lives. This is the darkest truth about footbinding. It wasn't just about controlling women or following tradition. It became a culture-wide sexual obsession with suffering, with limitation, with the eroticization of pain. Men desired women specifically because they were disabled, specifically because they were helpless, and women internalized this, understanding that love required suffering, that sexuality required sacrifice. The fetish transformed an entire civilization's understanding of desire, beauty, and what it meant to be human. Daughters for dollars. Picture this scene from 1850s China. A farmer and his wife sit by candlelight, calculating. Their daughter, age 15, tiny bound feet, perfectly shaped after 11 years of agony. Tomorrow the matchmaker brings news from the wealthy merchant family in town. Will they accept the proposal? The parents know the math. Their daughter's ruined feet, their ticket out of poverty. Her lifetime of pain, their investment finally paying dividends. This wasn't love, this was commerce. And daughter's broken bones were the currency that bought families everything they'd ever dreamed of. See, bound feet weren't just about beauty or tradition, they were a business card. 3-inch golden lotus feet announced to the world that your family had money. Why? Because you could afford to cripple your daughter. You could afford to have a woman who couldn't work in the fields. Her useless feet proved your wealth. But here's the twisted part. Poor families caught on to this game. They realized they could fake wealth by destroying their daughter's feet. Suffer now, profit later. The ultimate long-term investment strategy, paid for with a child's bones. The marriage market operated like a stock exchange, and bound feet? They were blue-chip investments. A merchant's son from a wealthy family needed a wife who matched his status. But status wasn't just about money in the bank. It was about appearances, symbols. A wife with natural feet advertised that the family was still common, still working class. But tiny, perfect bound feet? That screamed refinement, leisure, nobility. Even if the bride's family lived in a shack, those feet elevated her value, made her marriageable to men who would never look twice at her otherwise. Parents did the math constantly. The Zhang family had 3 daughters. Could they afford to bind all their feet properly? The bindings cost money. The girl couldn't help with farm work for years, but unbinding meant poverty forever. So they chose. Eldest daughter gets the full treatment. Perfect lotus feet. She'll marry well, support the family later. Middle daughter gets basic binding. Maybe she'll find a decent husband. Youngest daughter? Natural feet. She'll work the fields, never marry up. 3 daughters, 3 different futures, all decided by how much pain the parents were willing to inflict. Listen to this letter from 1847. A mother writing to her sister. Little May screams every night when I tighten the bindings. But I've seen what happens to girls with big feet. They marry farmers. They die in childbirth from too much work. They stay poor forever. I cry with her, but I won't stop. Better she hates me now than curses me later for not giving her a chance. That's the voice of desperation, of parents convinced that mutilating their daughter was actually saving her. The logic of a broken system. The wealthy merchant families? They held all the cards. They could afford to be picky. Son needs a wife? Let's see the options. This girl's family is poor, but look at those feet. Perfect 3-inch lotus. Clearly they've invested in her properly. They understand what's required. That girl becomes acceptable because her parents were willing to pay the price. Her suffering becomes their social ladder. The merchant family gets a wife who signals their status. The poor family gets a son-in-law with money. Everyone wins except the girl who can barely walk. Real story from Jiangsu province. The Wu family ran a small noodle shop, barely scraping by. Their daughter Li had the most beautiful bound feet in the village. Tiny, perfectly shaped. At 16, she married the son of the biggest rice merchant in the county. Wedding feast lasted 3 days. The Wu family went from selling noodles on the street to owning property, having servants, all because they'd tortured their daughter correctly. Li spent her wedding night weeping, not from joy, from pain. Her feet had been bound so tightly for the ceremony that infection set in. The economics were brutal but simple. A daughter with natural feet might marry a laborer earning a few coins per month. A daughter with bound feet could marry a merchant earning hundreds of coins per month. That marriage meant regular money sent back to parents, grandchildren who'd never know poverty, family name elevated in the community, but it required destroying the daughter's body. Parents borrowed money to buy the finest binding cloths, hired experts to do the binding correctly. They gambled everything on their daughter's mutilated feet, becoming the winning lottery ticket. From the daughter's perspective, you're 4 years old and your world becomes pain, but adults keep telling you it's for your own good. You'll marry well, you'll be wealthy, you'll thank them someday. Some girls internalized this completely, feeling proud of their tiny feet later. Others never forgave their parents, but forgiveness didn't matter. By the time you were old enough to understand what had been done to you, the damage was permanent. Your bones were set, your future was decided, your walking was dependent on servants and chairs for life. The wealthy families played their role perfectly. They made their preferences clear. We want wives with tiny feet. We want women who can't work. We want symbols of our prosperity. And desperate families delivered exactly what they demanded. The merchants never had to force anyone. They just had to wait. Parents lined up to volunteer their daughters as sacrifices to this system. Supply and demand, working exactly as designed. The rich got what they wanted. The poor competed to give it to them. And daughters paid the price. The competition between families got vicious. Mrs. Chen's daughter has 4-inch feet. Mrs. Liu will make sure her daughter has 3-inch feet. It became an arms race of suffering. Who could torture their daughter most effectively? Whose child would endure the most pain for the smallest feet? Mothers compared their daughters' feet at temple gatherings, judging each other's commitment to the process. The most successful mothers? The ones who could break their daughters' bones most completely while keeping them alive. That was expertise. That was good parenting. Long term, these marriages often ended in disaster. The girl married up, but she's essentially disabled, can't help with household work, needs constant care, frequent infections, chronic pain making her irritable, depressed. The wealthy husband gets tired of having an invalid wife, but divorce isn't an option, so she lives in a big house, technically wealthy but miserable and trapped. Her parents got their social climbing win. She got a lifetime of disability in exchange, the promised good life, usually just a prettier version of suffering, and the cycle continued. The girl who married up? Now she's wealthy. When she has daughters, she binds their feet even more aggressively. She's proof the system works. Her own suffering bought her family status. So she doubles down, demanding her daughters endure worse binding than she did. Success stories became advertising for the practice. Look at Mrs. Chang. Her bound feet got her a rich husband. Now she has servants and silk dresses. Proof that torturing your daughter is good parenting. Every success story created 5 more victims. The calculations were cold. Parents would literally estimate their daughter's worth. Small feet, wealthy husband, money for the family. But there were variables. What if the feet became infected? What if the binding went wrong? What if she died during the process? Parents hedged their bets. Maybe bind 2 daughters, leave one natural as backup. The natural-footed daughter becomes insurance. If the bound-foot marriages fail, at least one daughter can work and support them. Human resource management applied to your own children. Daughters as diversified investment portfolios. So we end up with this horrifying reality. Marriageable daughters defined by the extent of their disability. The more crippled, the more valuable. Fathers showing off their daughters' feet to potential suitors like prize cattle. Mother-in-laws inspecting bound feet on wedding nights to make sure they got what they paid for. The girl who could barely walk became the ultimate status symbol. Her inability to function normally proved her family's wealth and commitment. Success measured by the daughter's inability to escape, to work, to survive independently. That's the system. Daughters traded like commodities. Their broken bones the price of admission to higher social classes. Parents convincing themselves that torture was love, that crippling was kindness. The girls who suffered most married best. The families that went furthest in destroying their daughters climbed highest socially, and everyone called it tradition, culture, necessity. Tomorrow night we'll explore what happened when some families started refusing to play this game, when parents chose their daughters' health over social climbing. The backlash was immediate and brutal. Sweet dreams, relenting, and resisting. Here's something that might surprise you. Not everyone went along with footbinding. Yeah, I know we've been talking about how universal this practice was, how mothers broke their daughters' bones for 1,000 years, but there were holdouts, families who said no, entire ethnic groups who refused. And by the 1890s, women were secretly begging foreign missionaries for help, whispering in corners where their husbands couldn't hear them. The resistance was always there. It just took courage most people didn't have. The Manchu ruling class never bought into it. Think about that. The people who conquered China in 1644 and ruled for nearly 3 centuries looked at footbinding and said absolutely not. They saw it as a degenerate Han practice. Manchu women kept their natural feet, rode horses, hunted alongside men. The Qing emperor even tried banning footbinding for everyone in 1664, but it didn't stick. Han families just ignored the law. They'd rather risk government punishment than let their daughters have unmarriageable feet. The Hakka people never started binding feet at all. These were Han Chinese who'd migrated south centuries earlier, maintaining their own distinct culture. Hakka women worked in fields, managed businesses, kept their natural feet their whole lives. Other Han Chinese looked down on them for it, called Hakka women unfeminine, unmarriageable outside their own community. But Hakka families didn't care. They needed women who could work, walk, contribute economically. Function trumped fashion. Smart choice, honestly. Then there were individual families who quietly rebelled. Usually poor families who needed daughters to work, but sometimes wealthy families who just thought the whole thing was insane. These were dangerous choices. Natural-footed daughters faced social ostracism, struggled to find husbands, brought shame on their parents, but some families decided they'd rather deal with social problems than mutilate their children. Takes serious conviction to go against a 1,000-year tradition when everyone's watching. The most heartbreaking resistance came from mothers who'd been through it themselves. Picture this. You survived footbinding as a child, married successfully because of your tiny feet, then watched your 4-year-old daughter screaming as the binding started. Some mothers couldn't do it. They'd unwrap their daughters' feet at night, rewrap them loosely during the day, hoping to fool their husbands and mothers-in-law. Risky as hell. If caught, they faced divorce, abandonment, social destruction. By the 1870s, Christian missionaries started documenting something fascinating: women approaching them secretly, begging for help, convincing their husbands to stop binding their daughters' feet. These conversations happened in churches, markets, anywhere men weren't listening. The women knew something was changing. They'd heard foreign women lived normal lives with normal feet, but they couldn't stop the practice alone. Needed male permission, social backing, some kind of cultural shift that felt impossible. One missionary account from 1889 describes a woman grabbing his sleeve after church service, whispering urgently about her 6-year-old daughter. The binding had started 2 years earlier. The girl could barely walk, cried constantly, begged her mother to stop, but the husband insisted, threatened divorce if the binding stopped. The woman asked if the missionary could speak to her husband, convince him that footbinding was unnecessary, even harmful. Desperate mothers trapped between love for their daughters and social survival. These secret conversations revealed something crucial. Many mothers never believed in footbinding. They went through the motions because they had to. But privately they questioned everything. Why cripple healthy children? Why was a 3-inch foot more valuable than a functional one? The missionary records are full of women expressing doubt, guilt, desperate hope for change. They weren't sadists. They were prisoners of a system that demanded they torture their own children. The resistance created underground networks. Women who'd stopped binding their daughters' feet quietly connected with other families making the same choice. They shared strategies for protecting natural-footed girls, finding marriage matches within resistant communities, dealing with social backlash. These networks stayed hidden, had to. Public resistance meant social suicide, but privately, slowly, More families started questioning whether tiny feet were worth permanent disability. Change was coming, but it moved through whispers and secret meetings. Some women went further, actively sabotaging the practice. Grandmothers who'd been forced to bind their daughters' feet refused to participate with granddaughters. Servants pretended to follow binding instructions, but actually loosened bindings when parents weren't watching. Older sisters taught younger ones how to walk normally despite bound feet, helping them maintain some mobility and strength. Small acts of rebellion, but they mattered. Every natural foot was a victory against an insane system. The geographic pattern of resistance tells its own story. Northern China, closer to Manchu influence, had more families stopping the practice earlier. Southern regions, more isolated and traditional, held on to foot binding longer. Coastal cities exposed to foreign traders saw resistance before interior villages. Economic centers where women needed mobility for business had more natural-footed women. Geography, exposure, economic necessity, all factors that could overcome 1,000 years of tradition when conditions were right. But here's the thing about cultural resistance. It's messy, incomplete, full of contradictions. Families who stopped binding daughters' feet sometimes still insisted their sons marry only bound-footed women. Women who privately opposed foot binding publicly shamed other women for large feet. The practice was so deeply embedded in ideas about femininity, social status, and sexual attractiveness that even resistance was partial. People could reject the physical practice while keeping the mental framework that made it seem necessary. The 1890s brought organized resistance. The Natural Foot Society formed in 1895, promoting the radical idea that women should keep their natural feet. Chinese reformers argued that foot binding weakened mothers, which weakened children, which weakened the nation. This wasn't about women's rights, it was about national strength. China needed healthy mothers to raise strong citizens who could resist Western imperialism. Nationalism, not feminism, finally gave resistance movements the legitimacy they needed. Even then, stopping foot binding required incredible courage. Families faced social isolation, daughters struggled to find husbands, neighbors whispered about their backward choices. Some women who'd escaped binding as children felt ashamed of their natural feet, wondering if they'd missed out on the feminine ideal. The psychological damage ran so deep that even victims of the practice sometimes defended it. Breaking free meant rejecting everything their culture told them about womanhood, beauty, and value. The resistance stories reveal something beautiful about human nature. Even in the most oppressive systems, some people refused to comply. Mothers who wouldn't break their daughters' bones despite social pressure. Women who secretly loosened bindings despite their husbands' threats. Communities that quietly protected natural-footed girls despite cultural shame. These weren't heroes making grand gestures, just ordinary people who looked at suffering and said, "Not my child." Sometimes that's enough to start changing the world. By 1900, the resistance had grown from whispered conversations to organized movements. Women's natural feet became symbols of modern China, national strength, cultural progress. But change was slow, uneven, painful for everyone involved. The last generation of bound-footed women lived alongside the first generation of natural-footed daughters, each group sometimes judging the other. Resistance succeeded, but it took a century and left scars on mothers, daughters, and granddaughters who'd navigated impossible choices between tradition and change, pride and prejudice. Here's what gets complicated about foot binding. It wasn't just men forcing this on women. The women themselves, they had feelings about their feet that'll twist your brain into knots. Some were proud, others lived with crushing regret. And the worst part? Grandmothers who'd survived the breaking insisted their granddaughters go through it too. Tonight we're sitting in on the conversations that happened behind closed doors, where women talked about what it really felt like to live with broken feet. Picture this scene from 1890s Beijing. 3 women around a tea table. Grandmother with 3-inch golden lotus feet. Mother whose feet were bound but not quite perfectly. Young daughter, maybe 16, recently married. And they're talking, really talking, about what those tiny embroidered shoes actually meant to them. These conversations happened in every household. Women processing decades of pain, pride, shame, and complicated love. The emotions they shared? They'll surprise you. Lai Mifeng adjusts her silk shoe and speaks with obvious pride. Look at these feet, 3 inches exactly. Perfect golden lotus. She's 70 now. can barely walk, but her voice carries satisfaction. My mother-in-law examined them on my wedding night and wept with joy, said she'd never seen feet so beautifully formed. My husband, he treasured these feet his entire life. She pauses, touching the embroidered silk. I suffered for beauty, and I achieved it. But listen to Wang Kuihua. Same age, different story. I hate these stumps, hate them. Her voice cracks. 60 years of pain, 60 years of infections and rotting flesh and walking like a child. My feet are 3.5 inches, too big for true beauty, too small for any comfort. I lived in the worst of both worlds, neither perfectly beautiful nor naturally strong. Her daughter reaches over, squeezes her hand, the shame never left. The grandmother leans forward, voice sharp. You young women don't understand respect, don't understand sacrifice. She's talking to her granddaughter now, whose feet were bound just 5 years ago. I bound my feet at age 4. My mother bound hers. Her mother too. 5 generations of women in our family achieved golden lotus. This is our heritage, our dignity. You should feel honored to continue our tradition. The weight of generational expectation, it's crushing. But sometimes the granddaughters pushed back. Chen Xiaolu, 16, voice trembling. Honored? Grandmother, I haven't walked normally since I was 4. I can't run, can't dance, can't carry my own children when they cry. The foreign women I see in Shanghai, they walk with strength, they work, they move through the world like they belong in it. What honor is there in crippling yourself for men who fetishize your broken bones? The room goes silent. 3 generations staring at each other across a divide that's opening wider every year. Grandmother's eyes flash with anger, but also fear, because she knows the girl might be right. Mother sits between them, torn apart. She bound her daughter's feet because she believed she had to, but watching her child struggle, doubt creeps in. Was it really necessary, or was it just tradition becoming trauma? These household conversations happened everywhere as China began changing, women defending choices they'd never really had the power to make. Mrs. Zhou touches her feet nervously. When the matchmaker praised my lotus feet, I felt beautiful for the first time. My wedding photos, my husband's family displayed them proudly. These feet brought me respect, marriage, security. How can I regret something that gave me everything I was supposed to want? But her voice wavers. Everything she was supposed to want. And then the brutal honesty emerges. Liu Su-yin, mid-40s, mother of 3 daughters. I tell myself I'm proud of my feet. But you know what? I'm terrified they're becoming meaningless. My youngest daughter asks why she needs lotus feet when foreign women run businesses with natural feet. And I have no answer. My feet were my value. If feet don't matter anymore, what was my suffering for? The existential crisis was real. The defensive pride gets ugly sometimes. Women attacking each other over foot size. At least my feet are true golden lotus, not those boat-like stumps you call bound feet. Sharp words over tea, measuring each other's suffering like it's currency. Because when your entire worth was measured in inches of broken bone, every woman with different-sized feet became a threat to your identity. Competition born from shared trauma. It's heartbreaking to witness. But some conversations reveal deeper truths. An elderly woman named Feng Lianhua, speaking quietly to her daughter-in-law. You want honesty? I dream about running. Every night for 70 years I dream I have strong feet, and I run through fields like I did before the binding. I wake up and remember, this is all I'll ever be, a woman who hobbles. But what choice did we have? None. So we learned to call our prison beautiful. The regret was often mixed with fierce loyalty. Zhang Hulan, grandmother of 7, defending her choices even as she questions them. Yes, I bound my daughter's feet. Yes, I insisted on binding my granddaughters, because I love them. Because in my time, a girl with natural feet would starve unmarried. Was I supposed to let them suffer poverty to spare them physical pain? I made the choice love demanded. Even if that choice was terrible. And the intergenerational trauma shows most clearly in these moments. Mothers who'd survived binding watching their own daughters endure it, feeling simultaneously protective and powerless. I held her while she screamed, one mother whispers. Held my 4-year-old while she begged me to stop. And I kept wrapping those bindings tighter because my mother held me while I screamed. Because this is how love looked in our world. Broken love, but still love. As the 1900s arrived, these conversations grew more desperate. Women sensing change coming but not knowing how to navigate it. Should they bind their youngest daughters or risk their futures? Should they defend the practice that defined their lives or admit it was wrong? The psychological whiplash was intense. Generations of women caught between pride in their endurance and growing awareness that their suffering might have been unnecessary. What emerges from these intimate conversations is the full complexity of survival under oppression. Women simultaneously proud of and traumatized by the same experience, defending choices while questioning them, perpetuating practices they knew caused suffering because they couldn't imagine alternatives. These weren't evil women or ignorant women. They were women trying to protect their daughters in the only way their world had taught them, even when that way meant breaking bones. This cocktail of pride, regret, trauma, and defensive love, it couldn't sustain itself forever. When women started admitting their doubts out loud, when granddaughters began questioning grandmothers, when mothers stopped automatically binding daughters, that's when footbinding finally began dying. Not from external pressure, but from internal recognition that survival could look different. The practice ended when women themselves decided their daughters deserved better, even if they couldn't name what better looked like yet. Fall of the Golden Lotus. By the 1890s, something was shifting in China. After centuries of mothers breaking their daughters' bones without question, doubt was creeping in. Western powers were carving up the empire. Japan had humiliated China in war. Chinese intellectuals started asking uncomfortable questions. What if footbinding wasn't preserving Chinese culture? What if it was actually weakening it? Because here's the thing that's about to change everything. They realized crippled mothers couldn't raise strong children to resist foreign invasion. The reformers weren't thinking about women's rights, they were thinking about national survival. Kang Yuwei, one of China's most influential scholars, published essays arguing that footbinding created weak mothers. Weak mothers raised weak sons. Weak sons couldn't fight foreigners or build strong industries. This logic was brutal but effective. Suddenly, the same practice that symbolized Chinese virtue was being called a threat to Chinese strength. The empire was listening because the empire was desperate. In 1895, something unprecedented happened. Chinese women formed the Natural Foot Society. Think about how radical this was. For over 1,000 years, Chinese culture had demanded broken feet for marriageable daughters. Now educated women were publicly declaring natural feet superior. They met in secret at first, sharing Western medical texts describing foot deformities. They wrote letters to newspapers. They organized quietly, mother to mother, questioning everything their grandmothers had taught them. The society's arguments were clever. They didn't attack tradition directly, that would have been cultural suicide. Instead, they reframed footbinding as foreign corruption. Some claimed the practice originated with foreign concubines corrupting Chinese court culture. Others argued that truly Chinese women were naturally strong and capable. This wasn't Western feminism, it was Chinese nationalism wrapped around women's feet. And it worked because it gave families permission to change without losing face. Public demonstrations started appearing in major cities. Picture this: women with bound feet hobbling slowly through public squares, carrying banners demanding their daughters keep natural feet. Behind them walked younger women with unbound feet, demonstrating they could move quickly, work effectively, even run if needed. The visual contrast was powerful. Crowds gathered, some jeered, calling the natural-footed women unmarriageable and shameful. Others began questioning what they'd always accepted as normal. Pamphlets flooded cities with arguments mothers could understand. Bound feet prevent proper blood circulation, weakening the entire body. Children of mothers with natural feet are born healthier and stronger. Foreign armies march with healthy feet, while Chinese women cannot even walk properly. The medical arguments were sometimes questionable, but the political message was clear. China needed strong mothers to produce strong citizens. National survival trumped marriage customs. Western missionaries had been condemning footbinding for decades, but their criticism often backfired. Chinese families resented foreigners lecturing them about Chinese customs, but when Chinese scholars started making similar arguments that carried weight, Lang Qichao wrote influential essays comparing Chinese women to Western and Japanese women, arguing that China's enemies had strong mothers while China deliberately crippled half its population. The shame was working where moral arguments had failed. The Boxer Rebellion in 1900 accelerated everything. Foreign armies occupied Beijing. The Qing dynasty faced potential collapse. Suddenly, every aspect of Chinese society was being questioned. Reformers argued that everything weakening China needed to go, including footbinding. Empress Dowager Cixi, who had previously supported traditional practices, began considering radical changes. When empires face extinction, even thousand-year traditions become negotiable. The pressure for change was building to a breaking point. Regional governors started issuing local bans. Hunan province banned footbinding in 1902. Guangdong followed in 1906. These weren't just paper proclamations, they included penalties for families caught binding daughters' feet. Officials were ordered to inspect schools and verify that young girls had natural feet. Suddenly, the same government officials who had once enforced traditional customs were actively dismantling them. The change was happening faster than anyone expected. Families faced impossible choices. In cities where bans were enforced, binding daughters' feet could result in fines or social disgrace. But in conservative areas, natural feet still meant unmarriageability. Some families moved between regions based on foot policies. Others bound their daughters' feet loosely, hoping to satisfy both traditional expectations and new regulations. The transition period was chaos. Mothers caught between conflicting social pressures with their daughters' futures hanging in the balance. The rhetoric kept escalating. Footbinding wasn't just unhealthy anymore, it was unpatriotic. Newspapers published editorials calling bound feet national humiliation and evidence of Chinese backwardness. Students at new-style schools were required to have natural feet. Employment opportunities began opening for women with unbound feet, while bound-footed women faced increasing discrimination. The social momentum was shifting so rapidly that traditional families found themselves defending increasingly unpopular practices. Women's experiences during this transition were complicated. Some bound-footed mothers felt vindicated. They had always hated the practice, but couldn't stop it alone. Others felt betrayed. They had endured lifelong pain for nothing. If society was abandoning the beauty standards their suffering had served, many bound-footed women became advocates for change, not wanting their daughters to experience their pain, but some resisted, fearing their sacrifices would be forgotten if footbinding disappeared entirely. By 1910, the writing was on the wall. New-style schools refused to admit girls with bound feet. Modern factories preferred workers who could walk properly. Marriage brokers reported declining interest in bound-footed brides among educated families. The economic incentives that had sustained footbinding for centuries were reversing. Parents who had once feared their daughters couldn't marry without bound feet, now worried they couldn't succeed in modern China with them. The final blow came with the 1911 revolution. The Qing dynasty collapsed, and the new Republic of China wanted to demonstrate its commitment to modernization. Footbinding represented everything the revolutionaries were rejecting about imperial China, backwards traditions that weakened the nation while serving no practical purpose. The old order was dead, and its customs were going with it. The Golden Lotus was about to be officially crushed. On March 13, 1912, the provisional government issued the official ban. Footbinding was now illegal throughout China. The edict was brief but definitive. The practice of footbinding is harmful to the health of women and children, and is hereby prohibited. Violation could result in fines and imprisonment. After more than 1,000 years, mothers were legally forbidden from breaking their daughters' bones. The age of the Golden Lotus was officially over. But here's what's interesting. The ban didn't end footbinding immediately. Rural families continued the practice in secret for decades. The last generation of bound-footed women lived until the 21st century. Change came faster in cities than countryside, faster among educated families than traditional ones. The legal end of footbinding was 1912, but the cultural end took much longer. Some golden lotuses bloomed in secret long after they were supposed to die. The Unending Echoes. 1949. Communist revolution sweeps China. Footbinding officially banned. Case closed, right? Wrong. While Beijing celebrated liberation and progress, deep in rural villages, old women still unwrapped tiny feet each night, still rewrapped them each morning. The practice wasn't dead, it was hiding. In remote valleys where communist officials rarely visited, In farmhouses where traditions ran deeper than politics, footbinding quietly endured. The government said it was over. The world believed it was over. But in China's forgotten corners, mothers still looked at their daughters' feet and remembered. Here's what nobody talks about. Revolution doesn't reach everywhere at once. It spreads from cities to towns to villages to, well, some places it never reaches at all. And in those isolated pockets, the old ways persist. Not because people are backward or stubborn, but because change is terrifying when you've survived by following certain rules for generations. When your entire understanding of how women survive depends on 3-inch feet, you don't abandon that overnight just because distant politicians say so. Fear runs deeper than law. The data was encouraging. By 1950, Chinese surveys showed footbinding had essentially vanished. Mission accomplished. Western observers praised China's rapid modernization. Academic papers declared the practice extinct. But surveys only reached accessible areas. They counted women willing to admit they still bound feet when officials came asking. In regions where the nearest government representative was a 3-day hike away, where communist authority existed more in theory than practice, different realities persisted. The maps showed progress. The mountains told different stories. Rural isolation wasn't just geographic. It was economic, cultural, generational. These weren't communities choosing tradition over progress. They were communities where tradition meant survival and progress meant uncertainty. Elderly women who had suffered through footbinding, who had married well because of their bound feet, who had raised families and achieved respect through this painful system, they weren't convinced that abandoning it would benefit their granddaughters. Their lived experience said otherwise. Their scars said otherwise. Their marriages said otherwise. Zhang Yunying was born in 1912, the same year footbinding was officially banned. Think about the timing here. Her parents chose to bind her feet the exact year the government said stop. Not out of defiance, out of practicality. They lived in a remote village where that government ban was just rumors from far away, where local marriage customs hadn't changed, where a girl with natural feet still couldn't find a husband. So 4-year-old Zhang screamed as her bones broke, unaware she might be among the last. Her feet were tiny, perfect 3-inch golden lotuses, the kind that earlier generations had prized, that men had fetishized, that mothers had sacrificed everything to achieve for their daughters. Zhang married well, had children, lived the life her bound feet were supposed to guarantee, and for decades that seemed to prove the system worked. Her pain had bought her security, her sacrifice had purchased respect. Why question something that had delivered exactly what it promised? Why doubt something that had shaped her entire identity? But the world kept changing around her. The Cultural Revolution arrived. Traditional practices faced violent suppression. Bound feet weren't just unfashionable now, they were politically dangerous. Evidence of feudal thinking, symbols of oppression. Zhang learned to hide her feet, learned to minimize the pain, learned to pretend the chronic infections and mobility problems didn't exist. She watched younger women with natural feet taking jobs, riding bicycles, walking long distances. Sometimes she wondered what her life might have been. The hiding got easier as time passed. People forgot what bound feet looked like. Younger generations heard about footbinding in history classes, read about it in books, but rarely encountered actual bound feet in person. Zhang became a living artifact, a woman carrying 1,000-year-old pain in her body while everyone around her acted like that pain had ended decades ago. She couldn't complain too loudly. Complaints would draw attention to something she was supposed to pretend didn't exist anymore. In her 80s, researchers found her, anthropologists studying the aftermath of footbinding, documenting its lingering effects. They measured her feet, 2 3/4 inches long, smaller than most smartphones. They photographed the damage, toes folded permanently under, arch completely collapsed, bones fused in impossible positions. They recorded her story, but carefully, quietly. Even in the 1990s, talking about footbinding too openly made people uncomfortable. It suggested China's modernization wasn't as complete as advertised. Zhang's daily routine never changed much. Every morning, unwrap the bindings, wash feet carefully, checking for new infections, apply ointment to chronic sores, rewrap everything tightly, put on tiny embroidered shoes, walk slowly, carefully, pretending it didn't hurt. Every night, the reverse process. She had been doing this for over 90 years of the same painful ritual. morning and night. While the world outside celebrated women's liberation, Zhang maintained the most intimate form of oppression, alone. The irony ate at her sometimes. Her bound feet had secured her marriage, her social status, her survival in a world where women needed those things. But they had also trapped her in ways she was only beginning to understand in old age. She had never run, never danced freely, never walked long distances without pain, never worn normal shoes. Her tiny feet had bought her acceptance in a system that demanded women sacrifice mobility for marriage. The deal had worked, but the cost kept accumulating. By 2010, Zhang was one of perhaps a dozen women worldwide still living with bound feet. Documentarians sought her out. Journalists wanted interviews. Medical researchers studied her X-rays. She had become precious in a way, the last living link to a practice that had shaped millions of women across centuries. But precious doesn't mean comfortable. Being a historical curiosity while dealing with constant pain isn't dignified. It's lonely. Everyone wanted to study her feet. Few people wanted to understand her life. She talked sometimes about the other women, the ones who had died already, taking their bound feet and their stories with them. Village women who had endured the same breaking, the same binding, the same lifetime of hidden pain. They used to understand each other without words, shared glances when walking became difficult, shared knowledge about managing chronic infections, shared memories of childhood trauma that nobody else could comprehend. Now she carried all those memories alone, the last keeper of very specific suffering. Zhang Yunying died in 2020. COVID restrictions meant few people attended her funeral. News outlets noted her passing briefly. Last woman with bound feet dies at 107. A footnote to history. But her death marked something bigger than one person's passing. It marked the actual end of footbinding, not the official end in 1912, not the political end in 1949, but the lived end. When Zhang died, 1,000-year-old practice finally, truly finished. The last bound feet had stopped walking. Think about what she witnessed. Born when footbinding was still common, lived through its suppression, its hiding, its gradual extinction, watched the world forget what had been done to her, and millions like her, carried physical evidence of historical trauma in her own body, until the very end. She was walking proof that abolished doesn't always mean ended, that practices can survive underground long after they've officially disappeared, that individual bodies remember what societies choose to forget. As you drift off tonight, consider Zhang's legacy. She outlived the practice that crippled her, survived to see women's feet liberated, women's lives transformed, women's opportunities expanded in ways she could never have imagined as a child. But she also carried the consequences of old cruelties until her final day. Some echoes never stop. Some changes take lifetimes to complete. Some horrors haunt bodies long after societies have moved on. Zhang's story ended, but somewhere other abolished horrors might still be hiding, still echoing, still waiting to finally die. Lessons from a lost epoch. Here's what haunts me about footbinding. It wasn't men forcing this torture on women. It was mothers, grandmothers, the women who had survived it themselves, who knew every moment of that agony. They're the ones who held down the next generation of 4-year-old girls. And they cried while they did it. Because in their world, not breaking your daughter's bones meant condemning her to something worse than lifelong disability. It meant poverty, spinsterhood, social death. They chose physical crippling over economic destruction. Think about that logic for a second. A mother looks at her toddler and thinks, I have to destroy her feet to save her future. That's not cruelty. That's survival math. In a system so twisted that love requires violence. These weren't monsters. They were women trapped in an economic reality where marriage was the only path to security, and marriage required bound feet, so they became enforcers of their own oppression, generation after generation, believing they had no choice. The wealthy families started this whole nightmare, but they weren't the ones who kept it going for 1,000 years. Rich families could afford to be picky about feet, because they had money either way. But poor families? They saw footbinding as their daughter's only shot at escaping poverty. A bound-footed peasant girl might marry a merchant. A natural-footed merchant's daughter might not marry at all. The poor weren't victims of this system. They were its most desperate participants. Here's where it gets really twisted. The families who could least afford to lose their daughters' labor, they were binding feet anyway. Peasant mothers, crippling girls who should have been working in fields, hoping those tiny feet would buy passage into a better life. They'd rather have a disabled daughter with marriage prospects than a healthy daughter doomed to farm work forever. That's how powerful this system was. It convinced people to sacrifice practical survival for social survival. The women enforcing footbinding weren't just following orders, they were making calculated decisions about their daughters' futures. A mother in 1850 looked around her world and saw reality. Natural-footed women stayed unmarried. Unmarried women became beggars or prostitutes or burdens on their families forever. So she chose 2 years of screaming over a lifetime of shame. In her mind, she wasn't torturing her daughter, she was saving her. Love and violence became the same thing. What's brilliant and horrible about this system is how it made everyone complicit. Mothers bound feet. Mothers-in-law inspected them. Women gossiped about other women's foot size. Men fetishized the results. And everyone convinced themselves it was tradition, culture, the way things had always been. But footbinding wasn't ancient. It started around 960 AD. Someone's great-great-grandmother remembered when women had normal feet. Yet within a few generations it felt eternal and unchangeable. The truly sick part? The system worked exactly as designed. Bound feet did signal that a family had money because they could afford to cripple their working-age daughters. They became a luxury good, proof you were wealthy enough to keep a disabled woman. And once enough families started doing it, not doing it became economic suicide. It's like an arms race, except instead of building bigger weapons, you're breaking smaller bones. Women developed their own language around footbinding. 3-inch feet were golden lotuses, the most desirable. 4 inches were silver lotuses, acceptable but not ideal. Anything bigger was shameful. They had competitions, beauty standards, pride in their deformity. Because when you're trapped in a system, you find ways to feel powerful within it. You turn your oppression into identity. You make your cage feel like choice. It's survival psychology, and it's heartbreaking. The mothers who performed footbinding had their own trauma to process. Remember, they'd been through this themselves. 4 years old, bones breaking, years of agony. They knew exactly what they were inflicting, but they also knew what happened to unbound women. So they passed down their pain like a family heirloom, each generation hoping it would buy the next generation's safety. Trauma becoming tradition, suffering becoming strategy, love becoming violence. Here's what really gets me. When Christian missionaries showed up condemning footbinding, some Chinese women begged them for help, but not to save themselves, to convince their husbands to stop binding their daughters. These women knew the practice was changing, knew their daughters might not need bound feet anymore, but they couldn't make that decision alone. They needed male permission to stop torturing the next generation. Even revolution required patriarchal approval. The end came not from women's liberation but from nationalism. Chinese reformers in the 1890s argued that bound feet weakened women, and weak women produced weak sons, and weak sons couldn't defend China from Western powers. Notice the logic. Women's bodies mattered because they affected men's strength. Even the movement to end footbinding treated women as vessels for male success. Liberation came disguised as patriotism, and women's suffering mattered only when it threatened national security. But change was slow and uneven. The Qing dynasty officially banned footbinding in 1912, but enforcement was a joke. Rural families kept binding feet through the 1930s and beyond. Why? Because the economic realities hadn't changed fast enough. Bound feet were still valuable in marriage markets. Modern ideas about women's rights meant nothing if your daughter couldn't find a husband. Law meant nothing if survival required breaking it. Some women escaped. The Hakka minority never adopted footbinding. Manchu women were forbidden from practicing it. The very poorest peasants couldn't afford to disable their workers. But here's the twisted part. These natural-footed women were often seen as inferior, lucky to be excluded from refined culture, grateful they didn't have to participate in feminine beauty. The victims of oppression looked down on by those who escaped it. This pattern repeats throughout history. Women enforcing genital cutting in Africa, mothers policing daughters' virginity worldwide, grandmothers arranging child marriages. The enforcers aren't evil, they're trapped. They've learned that in a system designed to hurt women, the safest strategy is to hurt women correctly, according to the rules. Better to be the one holding the knife than the one under it. Compliance becomes survival. Survival becomes identity. The last woman with bound feet died in 2020. Zhang Yunying lived to 107, carrying her childhood trauma into our smartphone age. Her feet were broken in the Qing dynasty. She watched the rise of communist China, the Cultural Revolution, China's economic miracle. Her whole life spanned from ancient practice to modern superpower, yet she walked on broken bones until the day she died. Some kinds of damage never heal. Some choices echo across centuries. So what norms are we unconsciously celebrating right now? What practices do we perpetuate because we think we have no choice? What suffering do we normalize because it's always been this way? The mothers who broke their daughters' bones weren't monsters. They were people trapped in a system that made love and violence inseparable. They thought they were protecting their children. They were wrong, but they thought they were right. That should terrify us all. Echoes in modern China. Walk through any park in Beijing today and you'll see them. Elderly women sitting on benches, their feet tucked carefully under long skirts. They move slowly, deliberately. Some use walking sticks, others lean heavily on family members. These are the last survivors of footbinding women, now in their 80s and 90s, who carry 1,000-year practice in their broken bones. Their feet still hurt every single day. But here's what's really complicated about modern China and this legacy. Zhang Meilin is 92, lives in Shanghai with her granddaughter. Every morning she soaks her feet in warm water laced with herbs, the same ritual she's done for 8 decades. The pain never stopped. Arthritis settled deep in those broken bones. Walking more than a few steps requires enormous effort. Her granddaughter, a software engineer, watches this daily routine and feels something between pity and anger. Anger at a culture that did this. Pity for a grandmother who still carries shame about it. Because that's the thing about modern China and footbinding. It's not just physical legacy, it's emotional, cultural. These elderly women often feel embarrassed about their feet. Even now, they hide them, wear closed shoes even in summer heat. Some refuse to discuss their childhood experiences, shutting down when younger family members ask questions. Others, like Zhang Meilin, speak about it but with this tone of almost apology, as if they're sorry their suffering makes modern China look backward. The Chinese government doesn't really know what to do with this history either. On one hand, they want to acknowledge the suffering of these women, honor their resilience. On the other hand, footbinding represents everything modern China is trying to move beyond. The feudal past, the oppression of women, the 19 backward traditions that kept China weak. So you get this weird cultural amnesia where everyone knows it happened, but nobody really wants to talk about it in depth. Lai Wei runs a small museum in Nanjing dedicated to women's history. She's been collecting oral histories from bound-footed women for 15 years. The project started when her own grandmother, finally at age 89, began talking about her feet. Lai Wei says the hardest part isn't getting these women to speak, it's getting anyone else to listen. Young Chinese people often react with disgust or dismissal. That's ancient history, they say. We're modern now. But Lai Wei argues that ignoring the past doesn't erase it. Here's where it gets really interesting, and kind of heartbreaking. Some of these elderly women, despite decades of pain, still take pride in their tiny feet. They keep their embroidered shoes from when they were young. Show them to visitors as examples of beautiful craftsmanship. They talk about how their small feet helped them marry well, secure good lives for their children. It's this complicated mix of trauma and pride that makes modern Chinese people incredibly uncomfortable. The health impacts are severe and ongoing. Hospitals in major Chinese cities have entire departments dealing with complications from footbinding in elderly women, hip problems from decades of altered walking, spine curvature, balance issues that lead to falls, chronic infections in foot tissue that never properly healed. Dr. Chen at Beijing's geriatric hospital says they see these cases weekly. The government covers the medical costs, but quietly, they don't really publicize this ongoing legacy of an eliminated practice. Then there are the cultural debates. Chinese feminists want to use footbinding as an example of historical misogyny, proof that traditional Chinese culture was oppressive to women, but cultural conservatives push back, arguing that focusing on footbinding makes Chinese culture look barbaric compared to Western cultures. They'd rather emphasize China's achievements, the poetry, the philosophy, the technology. Footbinding becomes this uncomfortable reminder of practices that don't fit the modern Chinese success story. International scholars studying China often focus heavily on footbinding when discussing Chinese women's history. This annoys many Chinese intellectuals, who feel like Western academics use footbinding to paint traditional Chinese culture as uniquely oppressive. They point out that Western cultures had their own damaging practices, corsets that deformed rib cages, for instance. The difference is that footbinding lasted longer, affected more women, and left visible, permanent damage that's harder for modern China to distance itself from. Wang Shuying, 87, lives in a rural village outside Xi'an. She's one of the last women in her area with bound feet. Local officials occasionally bring visiting dignitaries to meet her, treating her as a living piece of history. She hates these visits, feels like an exhibit in a museum. Wang Shuying says she wants to be remembered for raising 5 children who all went to university, not for her damaged feet, but her feet are what makes her historically significant to outsiders. The erasure is systematic and subtle. Chinese textbooks mention footbinding briefly, usually in a paragraph about feudal practices that the Communist Party eliminated. Museums display antique binding materials, but focus more on their artistic value than the suffering they caused. Tourism sites that mention footbinding frame it as an ancient curiosity, not something that affected millions of women who lived into the 21st century. Its history being sanitized in real time. Some families are actively trying to document their mothers' and grandmothers' experiences before it's too late, creating private archives, recording videos, preserving the embroidered shoes and binding cloths. These families recognize that once these women die, direct testimony about footbinding dies with them. But many families resist this documentation, preferring to let painful memories fade. They want their matriarchs remembered for their strength and accomplishments, not their suffering. The psychological impact extends beyond the women who experienced footbinding. Their daughters, now elderly themselves, carry guilt about watching their mothers suffer. Their granddaughters feel anger about a practice they can barely comprehend. Great-granddaughters, born into modern China's relative gender equality, struggle to understand how women could have participated in their own oppression. Each generation processes this legacy differently, but none can completely escape it. Modern Chinese women's attitudes toward footbinding reveal broader tensions about tradition versus progress. Some see it as proof that Chinese women have always been oppressed and need continued feminist activism. Others view it as an aberration, not representative of Chinese culture's treatment of women. Still others use it as a cautionary tale about blindly following social pressure. But almost all agree on one thing: they're glad it's over, and hope their daughters never face comparable pressures. As China continues its rapid modernization, footbinding becomes increasingly distant and incomprehensible to younger generations. But the last survivors are still here, still walking carefully on broken bones, still managing chronic pain from a practice that ended almost a century ago. Their existence challenges comfortable narratives about progress being irreversible, about the past being truly past. They're living reminders that historical trauma doesn't simply disappear when practices end. Within the next decade, the last women with bound feet will die. Their direct testimony will be lost forever. China will then face a choice: preserve the memory of what footbinding actually meant to the women who experienced it, or let it fade into textbook abstractions and museum displays. The cost of erasure isn't just losing history, it's losing the hard-won wisdom about how cultures can normalize suffering and how long it takes for that suffering to truly end. Reflections of resilience. Think about that mother we met at the beginning, tears streaming down her face as she tightened those bindings. She knew every moment of agony her daughter felt because she'd lived it herself, yet she kept going. That's what gets me about this whole story. It wasn't evil people doing evil things. It was people trying to survive in a system so twisted that love looked like torture, and they convinced themselves it was necessary, that their daughters would thank them later. Here's what haunts me most. These weren't isolated incidents. We're talking about millions of mothers across centuries making the same impossible choice. Break your daughter's bones or watch her starve as a spinster. And here's the thing, most of them genuinely believed they were being good mothers, protective mothers, mothers who understood how the world worked and what it demanded of women. They'd internalized the system so completely that cruelty became an act of love. The economics were brutally simple. 3-inch feet meant marriage into a good family. Natural feet meant poverty, shame, social death. So mothers calculated. They weighed years of their daughters screaming against decades of potential starvation. They chose temporary agony over permanent exile. And you know what's terrifying? The math made sense. In that world, with those rules, crippling your daughter was the rational choice. That's how deeply broken systems can warp even parental love. But let's talk about the women who survived it. Because survival is exactly what they did. These weren't victims who just endured and died quietly. They adapted. They found ways to navigate their destroyed bodies. They created elaborate rituals around foot care. They turned their limitation into a kind of power, the only power available to them. They made the best of an impossible situation, and that takes a special kind of strength we don't always recognize. Some even took pride in their tiny feet. That's what adaptation looks like when you have no other choice. You find ways to value what you're forced to accept. These women embroidered beautiful shoes for feet that couldn't properly walk. They developed that swaying gait and made it graceful. They learned to see beauty in their deformity, because the alternative was madness. Human resilience is incredible, and sometimes incredibly tragic at the same time. The generational cycle is what breaks my heart. Grandmother binds mother's feet. Mother, now understanding the world's cruelty, binds daughter's feet. Daughter grows up and binds her own daughter's feet. Each generation thinking they're protecting the next. Each generation passing down trauma while calling it love. Breaking the cycle meant risking your child's future. Not breaking it meant guaranteeing her suffering. There was no good choice, only degrees of harm. And here's where it gets uncomfortable for us. We sit here judging these mothers, thinking we'd never do such things to our children. But would we? If our culture demanded it for our daughter's survival? If not participating meant social death and poverty? If every other family was doing it, and we'd be condemning our child to permanent outsider status? It's easy to be moral when morality doesn't cost everything you love. The women who tried to resist, they faced impossible pressure. Husbands who threatened divorce. Mothers-in-law who called them negligent. Communities that shunned unbound daughters. The system had antibodies against rebellion. It made resistance feel like child abuse, because in that world it was. A mother who refused to bind her daughter's feet was essentially destroying that girl's future. The system made its own perpetuation feel like the only loving choice available. But some women did resist. Eventually, the ones who helped end footbinding, they were mostly women who'd survived it themselves. They knew the pain intimately. They'd lived with the consequences for decades. And finally, when alternatives started appearing, when Western ideas offered different paths, they found the courage to say enough. These weren't outsiders criticizing from safety. These were survivors choosing to break the cycle, knowing what it would cost their own daughters. The end of footbinding didn't happen overnight. It took decades of arguing, fighting, social pressure going both ways. Old women insisting their granddaughters be bound, younger women refusing, families torn apart over feet. Because change is terrifying when survival depends on the old ways. Those final generations of mothers had to make bets on an uncertain future. They had to believe their daughters could succeed with natural feet, in a world that had always punished such women. What strikes me is how the practice reveals our capacity for self-deception. These mothers told themselves stories, that the pain was temporary, but the benefits were permanent, that suffering built character, that they were preparing their daughters for reality, not creating that reality. They had to believe these things to keep functioning, otherwise they'd have to face that they were torturing children for social approval, and that knowledge would have broken them. The women with bound feet who lived into modern times, imagine their feelings watching the world change, seeing their granddaughters walk freely on strong natural feet. Were they proud, bitter, confused? Some felt vindicated when footbinding was finally recognized as barbaric. Others felt their suffering had been meaningless. Many lived with both feelings simultaneously. They'd sacrificed everything for rules that were suddenly declared wrong. That's a special kind of loss. So here's the question that keeps me up at night. What are we doing to our children right now that future generations will find equally horrifying? What practices do we defend as necessary or natural that are actually just culturally normalized harm? What systems are we perpetuating because fighting them feels impossible? What pain are we inflicting while telling ourselves it's for their own good? Because it's happening. It's always happening. Every generation has its footbinding. Maybe it's the way we handle children's mental health. Maybe it's our education systems that crush creativity in the name of preparation. Maybe it's beauty standards that drive eating disorders. Maybe it's competitive parenting that steals childhood. I don't know what future generations will judge us for, but they will judge us, and they'll wonder how we could have been so blind to harm we called love. Just like we judge those Chinese mothers. The story of footbinding isn't just about China, it's about human nature, about how we adapt to systems that demand terrible things, about how love and harm can become so entangled we can't separate them, about how survival can make monsters of good people. These mothers weren't evil, they were human, trying to protect their daughters in the only ways their world allowed. And that's what makes their story so disturbing and so relevant. As you drift off tonight, think about resilience. Not just the daughters who survived footbinding, but the mothers who survived perpetrating it. Both lived with impossible choices in an impossible system. Both found ways to keep going. Human adaptability is our greatest strength and our most dangerous weakness. We can survive anything, even things that destroy us, even things we inflict on those we love most. Sweet dreams, and remember, the future is watching.